Hello and welcome back to the Frame Lab podcast with me, Gil Duran, and Dr. George Lakoff. Hey, George.
Hi, Gil.
Well, it's been a very interesting time here in American politics. Over the past month and a half, we've seen some unprecedented shifts and what really seemed to be a scary and uncertain race, with Trump appearing to be barreling toward a possible victory, is now a little more complicated. The Democrats have undergone a major vibe shift. Kamala Harris is breathing new life into the Democratic Party, energizing the base and a wide range of voters, filling stadiums where Trump is struggling to fill small auditoriums. It's looking like we have a cause for some slight optimism here in 2024. What do you think?
I agree. Kamala is doing a great job. Um, Something that when I first met her decades ago, she was hoping to be able to do and was nowhere near. And over these decades, she's wound up in a position to be able to be president of the United States, which is remarkable. There we go. And I think she has the best shot at being president, and I'm thrilled.
Well, you're definitely more optimistic than you've been in the past. So am I, actually. I don't think we could have anticipated the degree to which Kamala, who had been, sort of suffering from middling polls and a lack of enthusiasm, has suddenly energized Democrats. I think a lot of that is the energy of the Democratic base being hopeful, being desperate to find a way to beat Trump. And so I think people are focusing a lot of their belief and aspiration on her, but at the same time, she is acting as a great screen for that and has really taken up the mantle of that leadership and appears to be making the most of it. And so that's an important talent for a politician to have.
She's also a great communicator, whereas Biden was not. And that's extremely important. I mean, she's not only a great communicator in terms of the intellectual content, but also of the emotional content.
Mm-hmm.
She's a joyous, happy communicator, and she makes people feel happy, which is great. I mean, it's a very powerful thing to make people feel happy in what they're doing. That's a skill she has that is absolutely remarkable, and I'm very glad it's there.
Let's talk about happiness and joy for a second, because the New York Times had a piece this weekend that said joy is not a strategy. Kind of the thrust of it was that Kamala Harris has been able to channel joy and have this joyous vibe, but that's not enough for a campaign. I kind of disagree. I feel like if anger and hate can be a strategy, then joy can also be a strategy. It doesn't have to be the only strategy, and we're going to talk about that in a second because there's definitely another strategy at play here. But can you tell us what it means when a politician is able to channel joy and make people feel joy, and why is that powerful?
It's powerful because it plays on your emotions, and your emotions are everything in politics. If you feel good about somebody's political views, feel happy on it, if joining with them, voting for them, etc., makes you feel good, makes you feel happy, that's the most powerful thing there can be in politics. If it identifies with something deep in you, with who you really are most deeply, that's what this is about. This is about politics that identifies with who people are, what they need, what their values are, what their everyday life is like, all of those things. And that's what Kamala is able to pull out, which is remarkable. That's what a political leader really needs.
Those are some really good points. I think it's important to say that in addition to joy, the main theme emerging so far of the Kamala Harris campaign is freedom. And that's really what we're here to talk about today, because, there's been some recognition of the fact that for decades you have been urging Democrats to use the freedom frame to talk about their values in terms of the chief American value of freedom. And you haven't always been successful in breaking through to Democrats. But in 2024, that seems to have changed. And not only that, but it seems to be working. I should say that Joe Biden's campaign first announced that it would be running a freedom themed campaign. Of course, now he's not the nominee anymore, and it shifted to Kamala Harris, who I would say is doing a much better job of actually owning the freedom frame.
Absolutely.
I think the important part, and we wrote about this before on the Frame Lab newsletter, was that Biden announced that it was going to be a freedom campaign, put out an ad about freedom, and then we didn't hear a whole lot about freedom after that. It just sort of was an ad and a speech, and then the idea seemed to disappear. But as we saw at the convention, Democrats are really leaning into talking about freedom and framing their agenda in terms of freedom. Here's what former President Obama said in his speech. For them, freedom means that the powerful can do what they please, whether it's fire workers trying to organize a union or poison our rivers or avoid paying taxes like everybody else has to do. We have a broader idea of freedom. We believe in the freedom to provide for your family if you're willing to work, the freedom to breathe clean air and drink clean water and send your kids to school without worrying if they'll come home. We believe that true freedom gives each of us the right to make decisions about our own life, how we worship, what our family looks like, how many kids we have, who we marry. And we believe that freedom requires us to recognize that other people have the freedom to make choices that are different from ours. End quote. George, that could have come straight out of Who's Freedom or Don't
Exactly.
Think of an Elephant.
You
What do you
got it.
think of that?
Well, I'm glad that Obama got the same idea I did. I don't think he read the book. I think he just intuits it naturally because he has empathy. And that, the big thing, when Obama first, became famous, the first thing he said is the most important thing my mother taught me is empathy. To be able to understand what other people need and to get behind that. And that's important because what makes you happy is what makes other people happy. That's what real empathy is about. It's about making people happy, about making people fulfilled, about making people understand that this is a good thing, and rather than a bad thing, something you wanted to go along with rather than try to stop. That is what freedom is about. Freedom is about things that matter to you, right? And then being able to go along with the way they matter rather than have to stop, rather than being blocked.
He touches on the idea of empathy in that last line, and we believe that freedom requires us to recognize that other people have the freedom to make choices that are different than ours. And you said that before, you can't have democracy without empathy, without recognizing that other people also have feelings and thoughts. And if you don't have empathy, then why would you care that someone else voted for someone different? You
That's
wouldn't.
exactly right. I mean, democracy depends on empathy. It depends on doing something because it'll help other people, not just you. When I keep thinking about something my father told me when I was 7 years old, back in 1948, when there was an election up, and people were talking about democracy. And I asked my father when I was 7 what democracy meant. And he said, well, democracy means that there's no one better than you and you're not better than anybody else. Great description for a 7-year-old, right? And it's true. There's nobody better than you, and you're not better than anybody else.
So, what Obama does in this section is he defines freedom in a way that we don't usually hear it defined. Conservatives have been able to frame freedom as guns, as the freedom to impose their religion on others, as the freedom to be
Right.
racist and say what they please and not really care how that makes other people feel. The freedom to impose their rights on the freedom of everybody else seems to be very much what's coming out of the whole MAGA Project 2025 idea in a more direct and overt way.
Their
But
view is an authoritarian's view of freedom. The freedom to impose, that you have the freedom to impose on other people, not that you have the freedom to do what you want without imposing on other people. Without, that's a major difference.
and we should say there are different definitions of freedom, and we're going to get into that.
Yes,
You mentioned the freedom from constraints, but that's not the freedom from all constraints, not the freedom to kill people, not the freedom to hurt people, not the freedom to
exactly.
do harm. It's the freedom to achieve your potential in society and to not
You
be
don't have
limited in
freedom
that.
to enslave anybody else. You don't have the freedom to harm, right? The idea is that it is not imposing on on other people's freedoms.
That could get a little tricky sometimes because there's a
Right,
big debate.
because there are authoritarians who feel free to impose on other people's freedoms.
And if you don't allow them the freedom to impose on other people's freedoms, then you're curtailing their freedom, right? So we'll get down into some of the definitions of freedom here. But first of all, we talk a lot about framing, and that's been a big part of your uh, career and your research has been framing. But I guess a good place to start is, what is framing? Is it hard or is it easy? And how is it done? And when I think of framing, when people ask me what framing is, I generally say that it is describing an idea or a policy in terms of a moral value. So, not just talking about education is important and good for everyone, but education is freedom. Education is essential to freedom. Or, as you've said in your books, healthcare is a freedom issue. What we
Right.
call women's rights or the rights of people of color are freedom issues. And it's important to talk about these things as freedom issues. It's developing that association between the value in the word of freedom and the ideas or policies that you are promoting and that are a main part of your agenda. Is that kind of in the right zone? That's how I tend to think of it.
It is, but look, the history is interesting. I got this idea from my Berkeley colleague, late Berkeley colleague, Charles Fillmore, who saw framing as a matter of words, of lexicography. So for example, his example was that you come to a restaurant and it says a sign in the window, breakfast served all day. What does that mean? Breakfast, you don't wake up necessarily all day. The idea is breakfast is seen as as a frame concerning certain kinds of food. It's bacon and eggs or something like that, and it says that kind of food is served all day. And it says breakfast is served all day. So the term breakfast has certain things. Usually it's, when you wake up from when you go to sleep, but it's the kind of things you eat when you do, and that most people eat, which is, which in general is something that's in the culture. That's a cultural matter. And he says, when you see breakfast served all day, it means, look, there's the content. What is the food that is served at breakfast normally, and that's what's served all day. All right. That was the first example of framing I ever heard. And the idea is then, how do you get it to be a moral and political version of that? And that's what I've been doing, is taking that idea and making it into something that is moral and political.
So to be clear for our listeners, breakfast, the word breakfast means whatever meal you use to break your fast, right? So could be
Exactly.
anything. But in America, in the United States, we think of breakfast as bacon and eggs, or maybe hot cereal or cold cereal with milk on it.
Right.
In Europe, for anybody who's traveled in Europe and seen what they consider breakfast, it could be a croissant or it could be yogurt and cold cuts, which always trips me out in Europe that they eat cold cuts for breakfast. I don't really eat meat anymore, but cold cuts is not something I would eat. In Latin America, it could be a roll of bread, it could be beans and eggs. There's just different definitions of what that is. And so when you hear breakfast in the United States, you are talking not about the literal word food to break your fast. You're talking about the cuisine that is associated with breakfast. And so when we hear the word breakfast, we automatically have an idea in our head of what that means in terms of the content. And you're saying we got to do the same thing for something like freedom. There has to be a cascade of frames and associated ideas that are evoked when we talk about freedom. And that
Right.
Democrats have to do a better job of making sure that those ideas that are evoked when we hear the word freedom reflect democratic ideas and policies as opposed to just Republican versions.
Right. And an interesting version of this is one I grew up with. I was in a family where you didn't eat pork products. So, instead of bacon and eggs, we had salami and eggs, kosher salami. And, that was part of, yeah, that was a possible breakfast for us, but not for, people who, weren't didn't have those restrictions. And that, it's a cultural matter and it varies culturally.
Definitely. And so you got to make sure that freedom matters culturally as well than political culture. So let's talk for a second. There are different versions of freedom. The Democrats have a different idea or different ideas of what freedom means than the Republicans do. And there was a story recently in Vox where the writer wrote that Democrats are now using, quote, Republican language, end quote, to talk about their policies. But by conservative or Republican language, he meant using words like freedom and opportunity. And these are words that are not actually inherently conservative or Republican terms at all. Though it's understandable why somebody might assume that, because generally you have heard Republicans talking about freedom and patriotism and things of this nature. And it seems like for a few decades now, Democrats have stayed away from those terms because they're associated with
Mm.
Republican ideas. And what we're seeing now in 2024 is Democrats reclaiming freedom, reclaiming patriotism, and powerfully using it to appeal to voters. But when Democrats talk about freedom, they're talking about something very different, vastly different version of what freedom means. So, what are some of the differences between the Democratic and Republican, the progressive and conservative versions of freedom? And why is freedom in America generally a progressive idea?
Well, it's not. I mean, the point is that it's also, there's a Republican version of it. There's an authoritarian version of it. What is somebody free to use their power, for? So if you have power over other people, are you just free to use it at any time? Or are there constraints on your use of power? And the idea is that, for Republicans or authoritarians who have power, they feel they are, quote, free to use it in different places where Democrats or people who have empathy would not be free to use it. And that's important because there isn't just one freedom. It's what it is. It's in context, you know. So when do you feel free to use something or free to do something? Well, if it's something that, are you free to impose on other people's freedom, which is another very important thing. So if, my view of it is you're not free to just impose on people's freedom to live an ordinary happy life, an ordinary decent life. That is, and so that authoritarians who would impose constrictions on leading a decent ordinary life are not really free to do that. It's a different notion of freedom. That is, if your use of power, of your power over other people is unconstrained and makes them less free, are you free to make people less free, others less free?
Well, I'd say there are examples where you can, right? And I think one of the interesting things we've seen in the past few years is people on the far right try to use the idea that certain policies are tyrannical, specifically policies about health, vaccines. We just had the
Mhm.
pandemic, which is still ongoing, actually, but we had the lockdowns, which were important to protect public health and safety at the time, and masking rules, same thing. And some
Right.
people saw these as tyranny. and
Right.
as a complete revocation of freedom. Now, the counter argument to that is that we had to act collectively to protect people from losing their lives, to stop the spread of a deadly disease. And I think there we see this tension between an individualistic definition of freedom, where I am free to do whatever I please at any time and nobody can stop me, no matter if people die or if it causes major problems to society, versus the idea that freedom is served by all of us protecting one another and making sure that people's lives are protected so they're free to go on living and breathing and being part of society and the world. So it seems like freedom in some of the question of whether freedom can means the freedom to impose on others is contested in and of itself, right? And you
Right.
get into some deeper stuff here with some of those, but those are kind of rare cases for the most part, I would say.
They're not rare at all. The issue of wearing masks in order to protect against COVID is not rare. It's everywhere. That's a freedom issue, very important because when you wear your mask, you are actually protecting someone and hope and giving them more freedom to be free of sickness, to be have the freedom that health gives you when there's an epidemic. And this is, a tricky question. Some people think it's only a matter of, putting something on your face or not doing that, and you should be free to not put something on your face. But if this has to do with sickness and health for other people, and sickness that could lead to death, you're protecting somebody by saying you wear a mask. You're protecting lots of people by saying everybody should be wearing masks. That's not, your individual freedom. This has to do with disease.
In public, at the very least, right?
In
No one
public.
was saying you have to wear it in your house.
No, no, but in
Yeah.
public.
But freedom is a contested concept. It means different things to different people. To Democrats, it means the ability to achieve one's potential, and it may require action in society to guarantee that people have that, and policies to ensure access to what you need to reach your potential. The conservative view, it's freedom from government interference in whatever you do, and emphasizing the individual responsibility and rights to do it as one pleases when to do whatever one pleases with minimal regulation. And these are two varying views, and both have limitations, but both also have um, expectations, I guess one could say. So freedom is a contested concept, and there are some other ones as well, like responsibility. Responsibility is seen primarily as personal responsibility in the conservative worldview, individual accountability for your own success or failure. Nothing else determines your outcomes except for you in this idea. Whereas the progressive viewpoint is more that there is a social responsibility and that society does have a duty to ensure that all individuals have the opportunity to succeed. And that's very different from the Republican viewpoint. Fairness, conservatives tend to focus on things like meritocracy, that if you do the right thing, you'll get what you deserve and what you earn. Whereas progressives have an idea of fairness that is more concerned with systemic disadvantages and understanding that this has not always been a fair society and isn't one today, and that we need to take steps to remedy and make sure that fairness is respected. Morality is something you've written a lot about. Morality in the conservative way is about discipline and a clear sense of right and wrong based on an authority, often religious, whereas the progressive view is more seen in things like empathy, care, and nurturing, with an emphasis on protecting the vulnerable and doing what's best to open up opportunity and possibility to everyone in society. And so when we talk about framing, we're mostly talking about these moral values.
Right. And well, moral values certainly, or if you take moral values as things that affect other people, it's a very general notion of moral values. That is, what actions of yours affect other people, and what do you have a right to do to affect other people? So that's, that is part of morality. And that's important. And you have when you're acting in society, you have to think about what are you doing that could affect other people, or are you just acting in a way that don't have serious effects on other people's lives?
So there's differences between progressive freedom and conservative freedom. And I think you've written in the past that, I think it's in Who's Freedom, that
Mhm.
the progressive definition of freedom is expansive, that there should be more freedom extended to more people. Throughout American history, the idea of what freedom means has grown and expanded to include more people and more things. Previously, people of color didn't have the right to vote. Slavery was the law of the land in many places. And we have gotten rid of those things over time. American freedom has expanded. And so one could say that the progressive definition of freedom is an expanding definition of freedom, whereas it seems the conservative version of freedom is more restrictive and about shrinking back what freedom means to some previous definition, some halcyon era in the past where things were supposedly better and where less people had freedom. So you have these two competing versions
Mhm.
of freedom. And the key to winning the debate over whose freedom matters, over whose version of freedom is what Americans come to accept as the meaning of freedom, we need repetition. This is why Democrats have been failing so badly at this for so long. If you're not talking about freedom and selling the Democratic version of it, people think freedom is whatever Republicans say it is. So the important part of framing is to repeat the moral value, freedom in this case, as much as possible so that people develop these connections between freedom and healthcare, freedom and reproductive health, freedom and education, freedom and most of the Democratic agenda, which includes the freedom to elect our leaders, which Republicans seem less committed to these days. So, for those who don't know, why is it important to frame these messages in terms of values? And what effect does the language of morals and values repeated have in our brains?
Repetition changes your brain. That is, in the neural system, the more certain neural structures are activated, the stronger they get. So the more you hear something, the more you're likely to remember it. And that's why repetition is so important in political discourse.
So repetition changes brains. And so basically, for people still wondering, if we weren't clear enough before, framing is about repeating the moral language in association with certain ideas or policies until voters or listeners come to naturally associate those things in their minds because it's been repeated so often that it's become now a part of their mental structure of their brain.
It's important to understand that ideas are physical. They're not just abstractions floating around in your brain somehow. They're in your neural system. Ideas are physical things, and they change according to the way that neural activation changes. The study. That's why I've written a book with Srini Narayanan on the neural mind. It's very important to understand how brains work. They work in terms of things like repetition for that reason, because when you activate a neural system over and over, it becomes stronger. And that's why the repetition is so important. Political actors who know this say that. I mean, Donald Trump repeats and repeats and repeats. He's not stupid in that regard at all. I mean, he's constantly repeating his message.
And as people have pointed out, this is not the first experience Democrats have with the freedom frame. It's been a long time, but Franklin D. Roosevelt framed his agenda largely in terms of freedom, the four freedoms. So
Absolutely.
it's weird that at some point Democrats were able to get very far and make a great step toward progress with Franklin Roosevelt and everything that happened under his leadership, things we got that we didn't have before, like Social Security. And at some point in the past however many, what is it, 80 years or so, they lost that ability. And perhaps as a result of FDR, Republicans realized we have to start defining freedom as this other thing, freedom that means the opposite of what the agenda of Roosevelt is. I mean, they're still fighting to repeal a lot of what Roosevelt was able to accomplish under the New Deal. So it's not exactly new, right? And while your
Yes.
books have really urged Democrats to talk about it, you were largely only looking at history and saying this is what has been the most important idea in American history. And it's clearly the frame that has to be owned. And currently, only the conservatives are doing that.
By the way, I'm old enough to have heard Roosevelt. Even when I was 4 years old, but at the age of four, I was old enough to so that I remember things now that I heard and learned when I was 4 years old. Things that are important and that really meant something to me. And because my parents, told me about it, they repeated it to me.
Let's go to a few reader questions that we have that were submitted to us by FrameLab newsletter readers. Jennifer asks, what took Democrats so long to use the freedom frame, and why was there resistance to the idea?
I think it had to do with the use of it by authoritarians who felt because of their power, they were free to do things and didn't want restrictions. They saw that government protections were seen as restrictions. So when government acts to protect ordinary people from the misuse of power by corporations, say, the heads of the corporations see that as a constraint on their freedom, the freedom to use the power that they have, the economic power that they have. And that's an important distinction.
So you're saying that they were able to, the authoritarians, the Republicans, were able to frame freedom as a Republican or authoritarian idea. It
Right.
automatically triggers the idea that you're talking about Republican things, hence the Vox writer who said the Democrats have adopted conservative language, meaning the word freedom. So basically, Republicans were able to frame freedom as a Republican or conservative or authoritarian idea.
Well, see, what's funny is when they said adopt Republican language, they mean language with the Republican meaning of the words. But as a linguist, I know that the same words can have different meanings for different people. And is what's important. The same words did not have the same meanings for different people.
I think the other resistance to it, in addition to the idea that Republicans or authoritarians had framed freedom according to their values, we always come back to this. Democrats have generally not respected the science when it comes to things like language and messaging. They have chosen to do lists of policies instead, and have ignored what we know from cognitive science, from advertising, about the importance of that moral values and a moral identity being communicated in politics. And we've seen that ongoing. There are also some who think that using scientific methods, things like framing, is manipulative and shouldn't be used. And so they would prefer to lose the political battle than to engage in a scientific form of communication, which we understand that certain words persuade and move people, and that you have to use those strategies and those tools. So those, I'd say, are some other parts of why there has been resistance to the idea of framing.
Right. This is something that has frustrated me a great deal for many years. Uh, a lot of people who are Democrats think that any idea that requires a college education or a lot of education is not something that Democrats should be in favor of. And that's crazy.
Let's move on to the next question. This one's from Luke. Luke says, I've also noticed Democrats using words like fight and win which is more strict father framing. Could you explain the framing game board in terms of the key territories of the hearts and minds of your audience you want your frame to activate and capture, and how the dueling political parties' candidates might look at the moment on the board now that Dems have taken freedom?
Okay, well, it's very interesting. First of all, that's an excellent question. When Kamala Harris talks about fighting, when we fight, we win, and so on, she knows that there are people with opposite views that are socially harmful, that will harm most people. And she's trying to get views out there that are beneficial to most people. That's what that's about. And the fighting is against opposition of opposite ideas.
So fighting isn't inherently a strict father frame, I would say.
Exactly.
And neither
And
is winning. Winning is not a strict father frame.
that's exactly right. You know, now when I think about metaphorical thought, I don't think about fighting and imposing it because you have it naturally. I think about recognizing what you have. When I talk about framing, I don't think about fighting for it. I think about recognizing that everybody frames. Automatically you frame, you just have to be aware of what you're doing. So what I'm doing is saying I promote awareness of what you do without knowing that you're doing it. Awareness of metaphorical thought, awareness of framing, so that you know what you're doing. And because those things affect other people and have a social effect. So if you're acting in such a way as to have the social effect, you should know that you're doing it and how you're doing it and whether you really want to be doing that or not.
In addition to freedom, I'd say the other frames that are always in play that are contested concepts, justice. Democrats have to define justice in a way that
Yep.
is not playing into the conservatives. I think public safety is another one,
Right?
because there's this big tension and pressure, especially on Kamala Harris, who was a prosecutor and a district attorney and an attorney general when I worked for her as her communications director. This idea that public safety means harsh, punitive, mass incarceration solutions, as opposed to a wider range of solutions that try to avert mass incarceration when possible and lead to better outcomes, as well as the investing in the root causes of crime and dysfunction. And I think, you see a lot of pressure on Democrats. I think this is one of the main places Democrats fail on framing, is that they accept the conservative versions of what public safety means. Public safety means tough on crime. It means cracking down. It means arresting everybody and being draconian and harsh in your punishment. Kamala Harris, actually, when she was, I believe, Attorney General, wrote a book called Smart on Crime that was about not being weak, being strong when it comes to putting away bad, violent criminals who hurt people, but being smart in terms of looking for solutions that don't only rely on policing and mass incarceration to solve the problem. And I think that she's very well positioned to help define public safety and justice in a more democratic way without buying into the Republican framing. Our final question here is from Tamara. I'm excited and hopeful the Democratic framing has improved, but for the past 2 months, I've been getting the same repetitive framing from the right every time I see a YouTube commercial. It gets in your head like an earworm within seconds. What's the best path at this point forward for the Dems to counteract this? Well, I'll start by saying don't watch YouTube ads. It's
Yes.
terrible. They're trying to get you on an algorithm to feed you to the Republicans and get that stuff in your brain. Second,
Right.
I would say repetition works. You see, they're using it constantly. You can't turn on your YouTube or anything where Republicans can reach you and not get them immediately repeating and repeating and repeating your messages. So Democrats have to counteract it by repeating their messages.
But also by understanding what Republicans are doing, by understanding the repetition, by understanding that that repetition for most people will have an effect if they don't understand what's going on. And so, it's important to see what Republican framing is about and how repetition works, because you need to understand what's happening to people.
The
And also
more
what's happening to people when they don't know what's happening to them. That's important. Most people don't know that these things can get into your brain. They don't have any idea that this thing can happen.
Yeah. Although it's all around us all the time, right? The advertising around us helps us dictate what foods we buy, what stores we shop at, what clothes we wear, what we think is cool or interesting. We're sort of surrounded by these messages, repetitive messages, constantly telling you to buy this or that, to why does Coca-Cola have to have ads, right? To constantly remind people to drink Coca-Cola. So corporate America certainly understands the power of repetition. The Republicans understand the power of repetition.
Right.
And I think that with Democrats, the real challenge here is going to be, do we keep talking about freedom, or does the freedom frame fly away with some new idea, and now they're going to talk about all kinds of other things and go back to the whole list of policy things? Because with Democrats, they have a hard time being consistent and sticking with the repetition required to actually frame something. And one thing I want to say too is that the freedom frame is no guarantee that Democrats will win. We're way, way, way behind. For decades, Republicans have been framing this stuff. And it's good we finally started and we're seeing an impact in how it's a powerful thing to do. But it's still going to be a close race. And that's partly because the Democrats need to be framing all the time when they're not in campaigns, when they're in offices. And the failure to do that adds up to people not understanding what they're trying to say and how it affects their moral values. And that's so it's not some silver bullet that will suddenly save the day here. It's an ongoing process. And if there's one thing we remember out of this campaign, I think it should be that it's a process.
Right. Two more things. One, advertising. Advertisers understand repetition and they understand music. Music, certain kinds of music, when you with the words that go with it, the music reinforces the words so that you hear music that makes you feel, the music makes you feel good. And sometimes you get the music and they want you to pay attention to the music while taking in the words and accepting them. So that music in advertising is very important. But in political discussions, you don't have music as such. And it's an interesting question,
Well,
because it's supposed to be rational.
I'd say we do have the music this time. Beyonce's song Freedom is now pretty much the theme song of the Kamala Harris campaign. And so we not only have the words and the frames now, we have the music. Meanwhile, Trump's getting sued by the Isaac Hayes estate for using one of his songs without permission. So I'd say perhaps the musical moment has arrived. Anyway, George, thanks. That's all we have for this week. And we'll try to get some more of these out as the campaign season continues.
Thank you, Gil. Always a pleasure.